Dr. Jeff talks love. Dr. Jeff talks life. Answers your questions, cuts through the strife. Sex and intimacy, real and true. Evidence-based, made just for you.
Hello, welcome to Dr. Jeff Talks About Sex and Intimacy. I'm your host, Jeff Albaugh. I'm grateful you're joining us for this important conversation during Pride Week. Happy Pride Month. Happy Pride Month. Happy Pride. We have all kinds of festivities going on in Chicago this month. And so it is Pride Month. And this is episode 78, the 6 principles of sexual health, pleasure, freedom, and safer connection. So whether you're watching live or whether you're listening to the recording later, every moment of your amazing life matters so, so much. And I am truly grateful that you've taken time out of that life to be with us and learn. So thank you for being here. You're why this podcast exists. We are connected across so many platforms. We're on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. A quick favor, if you are on Facebook, follow us. The more people who follow us, the more we can do on Facebook. Thank you for following us. Visit the website. If you haven't already, visit the website to learn more about upcoming episodes on the calendar, or to watch previous episodes. So you can see there's 76. Tonight there'll be 77 episodes with amazing guests that you can pull up and watch. They're right on the website. You can also pull up the calendar and see all the people coming, all the amazing guests that are going to join me through September and October. And so please go to the website. You can take us with you. We are streaming wherever you go. We're going on Spotify, Amazon Music, on iHeartRadio, and more. If you're working out, work out to Dr. Jeff Talks About Sex and Intimacy. If you're on a road trip with your loved one, hey, listen to Dr. Jeff Talks About Sex and Intimacy. Learn more about your relationships and what you can do to deepen your relationship and to improve sexual health. As always, I want to remind everyone that all are welcome here. Gosh, especially every month, but in Pride Month, always, whatever your sexual orientation, your gender identity, or your relationship style, this space was created for you. You matter here. This space is for everybody. The mission of the podcast is really easy. It is pretty simple. It's to empower and enlighten you with the evidence-based scientific information that improves your sexual health, that deepens your loving relationships, so you can live your one miraculous, wholehearted life with more love. Who doesn't want more love in their life? Sexual health is about so much more than preventing disease or treating dysfunction. It's about living with authenticity, honoring our values, building meaningful connections with others, embracing pleasure as an essential part of being a human being. Yet, for many people, shame, stigma, fear, and misinformation have shaped how they think about their sexuality for years and years. So today we're exploring a framework that has transformed the field of sex therapy, the 6 principles of sexual health. These principles offer a compassionate, inclusive roadmap for understanding sexual well-being and creating relationships that are rooted in respect, consent, honesty, shared values, and pleasure. So, joining me is a certified sex therapist, Jennifer Monninger, who helps individuals and couples navigate these conversations with warmth and wisdom and curiosity. Love curiosity. Together, we'll discuss the origins of these principles, including their important connection to the LGBTQ plus community and the AIDS epidemic, and why they remain just as relevant today for everyone. We'll also spend time talking about one principle that deserves more attention, pleasure, and why it is not a luxury to have pleasure, but a vital component of sexual health. So, whether you're in a relationship, single, questioning, healing, or simply wanting to deepen your understanding of sexuality, I hope today's presentation and conversation leaves you feeling informed, empowered, and reminded that healthy sexuality begins with self compassion. It all begins with you and loving yourself. Let's get started. Jennifer Monninger is a licensed clinical social worker and a certified sex therapist dedicated to helping individuals and couples build healthier, more authentic relationships with themselves and with one another. Her work focuses on creating affirming, inclusive spaces where clients can explore intimacy, desire, communication, identity, and sexual well-being without shame or judgment. Jennifer's clinical approach is grounded in evidence-based sex therapy and is deeply informed by the 6 principles of sexual health. These were developed, if you don't know about them, by Doug Braun-Harvey and Michael Vigorito. She is passionate, Jennifer, about helping people understand that sexual health extends far beyond the absence of disease and dysfunction. So, Jennifer's clinical approach is grounded in evidence-based sex therapy. And so we are going to, without further ado, welcome her onto the show. I am so excited to hear more about these 6 principles of sexual health. Welcome, Jennifer, and thank you for taking time out of your busy life to be a part of the show.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, without further ado, I can't wait to hear more about the 6 principles and your presentation. So I'm going to hand it over to you.
Sure. So I'll just talk at you a little bit about the history of the 6 principles, why I think they're important, why I think they're relevant to the LGBT community and everyone really who has any sort of sex life, which is most people. So as you mentioned, the 6 principles were developed by Doug Braun-Harvey, but they are rooted a little bit further back. They really came out of a report from the Pan American Health Association and the World Association for Sexual Health, which held a regional symposium back in May of 2000. After, they were really seeking to redefine sexual health and look at it kind of as you mentioned, not as just the absence of disease, but how can we have a more holistic sense of sexual health and the ideals that define it. So part of that came from, the HIV epidemic, which was a catalyst for these sort of ideals and trying to explore a different way of looking at sexual health. So in looking at prevention initiatives with the HIV epidemic, there was a realization that when prevention initiatives focus on a disease model and kind of problems, and shame and prevention, and creating barriers, condoms as a barrier, as the only way of preventing HIV, it really was shaming, and it kept a lot of people from engaging with prevention initiatives in a meaningful way. And it really reduced the efficacy of those interventions. But if the narrative could be shifted from problems and prevention and disease, I call it the body parts and diseases model, which is still a sex ed model that is pervasive in this country to this day. If we can shift from body parts and diseases to a more holistic approach that also looks at pleasure, also looks at values, also looks at the relational elements of sexuality that frankly are way more fun, it just lands with more people. So they came out with this massive report from the Pan American Health Association and the World Association of Sexual Health Symposium, was a massive report. So Doug Braun-Harvey, who's one of my mentors and a really fantastic sex therapist based out of San Diego, he was working with men who were struggling with out of control sexual behavior. That was really the focus of his clinical work. And he reviewed this report and noticed some themes that he thought were interesting that could be refined to make it more accessible for the general population. And from that, he created these 6 principles that really lay the foundation for modern sex therapy. I think there's something that is important for everyone to know about. He called them principles rather than rules, because principles, if you violate a principle, it has a natural consequence. And if you are not living within the 6 principles, generally you experience negative consequences in some way, or something comes from that that is undesirable. And so the idea behind it also is looking at it, we call it sexual health instead of healthy sexuality, because healthy sexuality is really binary. And we want to get away from healthy, unhealthy, good, bad, right, wrong narratives to really look at sexual health as a whole concept, as a framework. And that's part of where these principles are from. So the 6 principles are consent, non-exploitation, honesty, shared values, prevention, and pleasure. And they're sort of intended to kind of exist in pairs. So consent and non-exploitation are both really about integrity. I define consent as being able to say no without consequences. And that is a definition that kind of comes from the kink community that I really love, that we should be able to say no without consequences to anything that's going on. And we should be able to have an open dialogue about what do we like, what do we not like, and what are we agreeing to, what's going to go on, and how do we feel about it. And we should be able to shift that narrative at any point. Non-exploitation to me is not having any covert power differences. So a lot of people are into power exchange. And if it's consensual, right? If it's communicated clearly in an overt way where everyone is in agreement, then that's great. Exploitation is more of a covert power difference where one person may know something more than the other people. One person may be manipulating or taking advantage of the other person in a way that really creates a power imbalance that becomes a source of conflict in the situation. The next couple is honesty and shared values. So those are kind of the most subjective. What do we want to share with our partners? What values do we hold as most important in our sex lives, in our relationships? Are we communicating those directly? Are we being honest about what is most important to us, about our desires, about our interests? And then the next 2 are prevention and pleasure. And those represent really the delicate dance that we all do in our sex lives of how do we have both? How do we have safety and prevention, prevention of unwanted pregnancy, prevention of illness? How do we have that and also find pleasure in sex? And can we kind of carry those with equal importance? And so that's kind of a summary of the 6 principles, of their history. And I think they're broadly applicable, and we could go into more detail on each one individually if we want. But for now, that's our overview. We can kind of take it from there.
All right. Great. Well, so I think that when we're looking at these principles and people are thinking about them and how they might really operate in their own lives, how do people really utilize them in their own sexual situations? How do you find is most helpful for them to embrace them and utilize those principles in their intimacy and sex life?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the first one, consent, is maybe in some ways the most complicated. Something that we do a lot of work in sex therapy teaching people about. I know your last guest spoke a little bit about religious trauma, and I've certainly worked with a lot of folks who come from high demand religious environments where consent was not really a discussion. We don't have a culture of consent in this country at all. And so the first step to kind of ingraining these principles in your life is figuring out what consent means. How do you define consent? Are you having consensual sexual experiences? Uh, are you having a dialogue with your partner about consent and what that means for them? This alone is really complicated, I think, and we see that across our culture with a lot of different controversies that come out here and there, that we don't have a good understanding of this principle. And it kind of lays the foundation for everything that comes after it. Go ahead.
Yeah, interestingly, I think what people don't always understand is that consent is an ongoing process. It's not something that happens at the beginning of sex. It's something that's negotiated throughout, that we make sure everybody is fully participating, that they want to be there and they're consenting to whatever's going on. And I think, like you said, the kink community really does provide us with some good guidelines, because they have literally like escape words. They have a lot of things built into what consent means when they're using some of the different things that they're doing. And so I think people don't always understand that it's a dynamic, living, breathing thing, consent, that moves along with between the two people as they move through their sexual encounter or intimate experience.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's not a blanket. And it's also very tough. The reason I say, to me, pleasure is one of the most important principles. I think all the other principles link back to pleasure, and it's hard to have pleasure in sex without the existence of the other principles. And so to me, consent is also about pleasure. If you're consenting, you're thinking about, what do I want? What is pleasurable to me? What is enjoyable or interesting to me? Also, what is a maybe? And then, are we aware of our hard no's, and are we articulating those as well? And can we exist in the in-between space in a way that feels safe?
And that's a really important point you bring up too, is really when we think about safety, when we think about what really is safety, because we can't really have intimacy without safety, right? We have to feel safe. And I know many of my patients struggle with, they don't feel safe. And so I think that's something that is inherently important for you to enjoy intimacy and sex, is to have that safety there.
Yeah. And non-exploitation, the second principle, kind of
Mhm.
carries that with it a little bit too. And it's a little bit different, and can show up in interesting ways. I see folks who feel like maybe their partner is manipulating them in some type of way. Maybe their partner is not being entirely honest with them. And that creates a sense of distrust, a feeling of exploitation that really impacts the sexual experience and impacts the pleasure that you can find in it. I also think that finding pleasure in sex requires vulnerability. And if we're going to be vulnerable, we have to have a sense of safety. So that's an essential component.
And that safety, it's not just an absence of conflict, of problems, of feeling like, but it's actually the presence of respect, that respect is really there. And I think that's where too, with some of this exploitation things, I know one of my patients was just telling me, I don't even know what I like or what I would really enjoy, because it's never been about me. And she was complaining to me. She said, why every person I meet, it's about what I can do for them, how I can be their, a sexual toy or whatever. This is not safety. This is definitely when we're talking about sexual exploitation. So I think it's really important for people to realize that what true sexual health and healthy relationships are, and they don't look like that. They don't look like that at all, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And we see that a lot too. At least I see it in my practice, in the presence of sexual pain, that we get into this place where consent and exploitation can be a real challenge, because partners will push, the partner who doesn't have pain will push the partner who does to, push through it anyway, or just keep trying and it'll get better, or, do it for me, even if it's not good for you, because, we're married or we're in this relationship and this is my expectation. And all of that really erodes safety and trust, and significantly impacts pleasure, I think, for all parties involved.
Yeah, and so I really think protection's important, that you feel like you know, that you can be comfortable and that it's your own body and you have governance over it. I think that's really, really super important. So I think when we think about these principles that have to do with non-exploitation and protection, you know, there shouldn't be that situation unless it's different. You're in a situation where you've negotiated dominance or something because it's more of a kink situation. But in a general situation, you should not feel exploited. You should not feel beholding to the other person. And really, like, even I think, gosh, do you really want to have intimacy with somebody who feels like they're doing it just for you and it's a beholding, something to tick a box or something? Um, these principles, they're living, breathing things.
Absolutely. But if we, going back again, also the guest last week and religious trauma and high demand religious environments, I think, I don't know if they talked about purity culture, but, purity
Yes.
culture is really deeply rooted in a lot of these high demand religious environments. And my sort of hot take, which maybe isn't that hot really, is that purity culture is really rooted in rape culture and this idea that you owe your partner something. And especially, it's very cis heteronormative, and especially women owe their male partner sex, and that's your obligation as a wife. And if you don't do that because you have pain, because your partner's not very nice to you, because you don't have a sense of safety for whatever reason, that makes you a bad partner. And those narratives can be really deeply ingrained. I'm here in Phoenix and we have a lot of evangelical community, Catholic community, LDS community, where those narratives are really strong. And so going back to the original question of how do we support people in living these principles in their lives, we have to really go back pretty far in their lives sometimes. Most people aren't taught really what consent is, or their idea of what consent is ingrained in puritanical cultural narratives that, are frankly a little rapey. And we have to deconstruct a lot of that before we can get even down to the pleasure parts, right?
Definitely. And what's really interesting, and we have two previous episodes. Anne Russo did one on purity culture, and we have a whole nother one. So Anne did last week, but she did a previous one on purity culture. We had a whole nother sex therapist talk about purity culture as well. Two previous episodes were kind of dedicated to that. And that was something driven by our listeners that they asked for. And purity culture is not the only culture that maybe have caused religious trauma, but we happen to have a couple episodes on that, and I think it's really important. So we can't get to that place of honesty and pleasure and those kind of places and being authentic if we don't have the respect, if we don't have the safety, if we don't have all those other things in place. They're not going to happen.
Absolutely. Yeah. And another place I like to highlight where especially non-exploitation comes up, and this leads us a little bit into honesty and shared values as well, is infidelity and open relationship dynamics. And in the sort of ethos of the six principles, we see infidelity as inherently exploitative, because the person who is engaging in infidelity knows a lot of things that their partner doesn't know, and it gives them a sort of power and control and a different way of responding to their partner in a lot of different situations that their partner doesn't really have insight into and isn't aware of at all. There's a whole dynamic going on in the relationship that their partner is part of and completely unaware of, and we see that as exploitative. So that's another piece when we look at infidelity, when we look at sometimes out of control sexual behavior, we really talk about consent and we really talk about exploitation. And what agreements do you have in your relationship? And are you honoring your relationship agreements? Are you violating any of your relationship agreements? And that kind of carries over from exploitation into honesty and into shared values as well.
Definitely. And I think, gosh, there's not a lot of contraindications for integrative behavioral couple therapy, but infidelity is one, because we can't really work on a relationship when there's not honesty and truth and there's someone else involved that's not even present. So I think you're absolutely right. We can never, as couple or sex therapists, or sexuality counselors, we can't really, we cannot support any kind of domestic violence of any kind of exploitation. And also So if infidelity, and sometimes we don't know this in the beginning of working with people, but it comes out over time, but it is a form of exploitation. But what we want to get to a place of with these principles is that honesty, being able to show up authentically in that relationship, to be real. And it's so damaging to the relationship, that infidelity, but it's also even damaging. Oftentimes, I have some of the people who are involved in the infidelity itself, they're like living this secret life, and they're struggling with this. I don't even know who I am because I have these two lives. And then you have the poor person who doesn't know. It's not okay. But when we get to a place of honesty and those shared values that we both believe these are really important things, now we have this space where we can be seen and heard and deeply connected. That's where intimacy comes in, to feel really deeply connected, to feel seen and heard and without judgment, and to be able to show up and be present, which is a wonderful thing. And if you haven't experienced that, listeners, I hope you have, and I hope you do. And that's not just in sexual relationships, but that you have people in your lives that you can truly be present with and show up authentically with, because that is one of the greatest, most wonderful things about relationships. And what we're hardwired for is deep connection with others, authentic, real connection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that honesty piece, as you mentioned, is not only honesty with others, but also, are you honest with yourself? Are you honest with yourself about your desires, about what brings you pleasure? What are in the context of sex, what are your sexual interests? And are you honest with yourself? Are you comfortable with those? Or do you live in a place of shame with your own desires? We call that being erotically conflicted, when folks struggle internally with their own desires and judge their own desires, because maybe those desires are in conflict with what they've held as their values for a long time. And that is a common recipe for infidelity, which is, I have a kinky interest and I don't feel comfortable with my partner with that. So I'm going to go outside of the relationship to fulfill that desire. Or maybe I think I'm polyamorous and really I think I might prefer an open relationship, but I don't have a context where I can bring that to my partner. So I'm just going to, we call it creating your own treatment plan. I'm just going to create my own treatment plan for my desires and kind of get them fulfilled somewhere else, and violate my relationship agreements because I'm not comfortable bringing these things to my partner. And that is an honesty and a values problem. And then it also goes back up to exploitation as well.
Yeah. Wow. Let's unpack a little bit with shared values, and then we'll move on to lastly, and what we really want to get to as well is that mutual pleasure. But tell me a little bit more about shared values and how that principle really comes into action within a good, healthy sexual relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think shared values. So again, the honesty and shared values are some of the most subjective principles. So they really show up in a lot of different ways for different people. To me, shared values is a lot about communication. And do you know what you value in sex and what you value in relationships? What sort of relationship structure feels important to you? What do you value even around family, around a lot of different areas of life that this applies to? This can be religious values too. And are we on the same page about that? Monogamy, I think I already mentioned, all of these things kind of speak to values and what is important to you as an individual in your sex life, in your relationship. And how do you talk to your partner about that? And are you both on the same page with it?
And really importantly, remember, listeners, we're not talking about people who are polyamorous, people who are in open relationships. That's a whole different set of consents and things that are in your relationship that probably has boundaries and guidelines around it. But that's a whole different thing. We're talking about a monogamous relationship where someone does, or just in whatever relationship with someone's not being completely honest and truthful. So they're doing things that violate or break that sexual health contract really that you have with each other. So it may not be a written contract, but it's real. It's the boundaries and guidelines that you live by in that relationship, but it's not Not to say that people don't have polyamorous relationships or have open relationships and have guidelines and things around that, which is perfectly fine as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I bring that up a little bit too, because I think going back to an infidelity context, when I work with people who maybe have sort of chronic histories of infidelity, I start to have a dialogue with them about, are you really a monogamous person? And
Right, right.
does monogamy make sense for you? And
Is it
this is,
what you want? Is it,
yeah,
where you want to be?
because history shows us that every time you try to be monogamous, it doesn't work out so well. So maybe we need to examine that a little bit. So that's one of the values things. And often we explore this in the context of folks who have a lot of shame because, like I mentioned, they are erotically conflicted, and
Mm,
maybe their sexual desires that keep coming up for them are in contrast with historically what they have valued in their lives. Uh,
mm,
and that can be challenging. I work a lot with folks who are exploring their orientation, exploring their identity and really struggling with, I think I'm gay, or I think I'm queer, or I think I'm trans, but also that doesn't fit within this kind of narrow scope of values that I've been fed for so long in my life. And so how do I restructure? How do I figure out the values that are important to me? What fits, what doesn't fit, what aspects of my identity work with my values? Where are my values in contrast with my lived experience and sense of self? And reconciling all of that can be really complicated.
But also very healthy and freeing, because I think that sometimes, again, coming to terms with who you really are, what you really want, and then and speaking that into your life and into your relationships honestly and openly. So let's get to just a little bit about the mutual pleasure as we finish up talking about these 6 principles, because that's a big one, and that's the one that both of us are like, wow, this is a really important principle as well.
Yes. Yeah. So the last two are prevention and pleasure. And like I
Yes.
mentioned, kind of paired together as sort of the delicate dance that we all do of how do we find pleasurable sex lives and find pleasure and joy in sex and embrace the fun parts and all of the joyous elements that we can have with a sex life with a partner that is within these principles. How do we embrace that and also have an eye on prevention of pregnancy, unwanted pregnancy, prevention of disease? How do we kind of hold those together? And pleasure is my favorite principle. I think it's the most important, arguably, because we have such a disease focus still in sexual health. We focus so much on problems and challenges and how all these things can be bad. And we have to really keep an eye on pleasure. And Doug has since refined it to that pleasure is pleasure and mutual pleasure. So not pleasure as in your solo pleasure in your sex life, self-exploration, masturbation, finding your own pleasure in your sexual self and your embodied self. And then also, how do we find mutual pleasure? How do we maintain that pleasure in the presence of another person and also hold our role in someone else's pleasure along with our own pleasure in a sexual experience?
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. And when we think about pleasure, I think often people are like, what does pleasure look like for you, listeners? What is it? What does it really look like? And I've really been trying to explore that with some of my sexual trauma patients who are just like, it's never been about that. It's not pleasure. It's not really been pleasurable for me. And it's so sad to think, gosh, a lifetime of not really having pleasure in intimate and sexual relationship, but it is still possible to have that for sure. And so it's just kind of thinking about what really makes you happy, what really brings you pleasure in terms of connection, intimacy, and sex. What feels good? What is good? What's right for you? And it may be totally different than what's right for someone else. So I think pleasure is it's a wonderful, exciting concept when we think about really what feels good. Using your senses, what tastes good, what feels good, what smells good, how can you integrate things between the two of you into your love play that feels good. That's pleasure. I always try to remind my patients too. I say, my homework's supposed to be fun. This is supposed to be a good time. Please don't make my homework fun. We're not drilling on your teeth. We're not doing things like that. What you're doing should be fun when we're trying to feel more. Because I say, each week, if I've given you assignments to work on, like the sensate focus we do sometimes and have talked about this show in previous episodes, but I'll say, your ultimate goals are connectedness and pleasure. And if you felt deeply connected and you had a good time, whatever you did, you succeeded. You did it. So I think sometimes we lose sight of that because we think, well, it has to be about this. It has to be about genitals. It has to be about penetration. It has to be about whatever. And it doesn't. It's about presence, not about performance.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's also a narrative. I keep carrying forward the purity culture pieces, and I think there's a narrative in our culture that if something is too pleasurable, we have to be careful, or if something has a high likelihood of pleasure, then we need to tiptoe around it, or we need to be careful because we could get carried away, or it could be too much, or there's, I think, a lot of narratives around that are harmful and take us away from being in an embodied sexual experience and realizing that our bodies are sources of pleasure and we can have fun with that. Don't have to be afraid of it or avoidant of it.
So many people struggle with not feeling that they are worthy of or deserving of pleasure or love and belonging. But you are, listeners. You are worthy of that. So a couple questions came in. I grew up in a very religious or shame-based environment where sex was never talked about positively. How can someone like myself begin to embrace these principles without feeling guilty or conflicted, which is part of that sometimes religious trauma or shame-based culture?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's why I love the principles, because you really get to make it up. And so I think there's a piece of it where you define for yourself what feels right to you, what feels good to you, what makes sense. Some of that honesty and shared values piece. People who grow up in those environments and maybe are shifting their sense of themselves and their worldview, leaving those types of environments, there's a lot of work to be done on values, which is one of the principles. What are your values now? What do you want your sex life to look like? What do you want your life in general to look like if it doesn't have this sort of doctrinal kind of moral floor, and you get to make up what it looks like for you? And it can be very scary. And I think being aware, being present to the feelings of shame, I like to differentiate, guilt is feeling like you did something bad. Shame is feeling like it makes you a bad person. And I think we have to separate those two and start to look at, do you feel like you've done something bad? Do you feel like there's something you regret that you want to do differently? That's actionable. We can be curious about that. We can understand that. If you feel like it makes you a bad person, that's a rather different conversation. And that is kind of rooted in that sort of moralistic, religious foundation that we have to look at a little bit. How much do you believe that anymore? Why do you believe that? And what still holds true to you now, and what doesn't anymore, and how do you reframe? It's a journey for sure.
It is a journey, definitely a journey. And I think I love Brene Brown's work. She's a shame researcher, and I've done some of her workbooks and everything because, we all have shame. We all feel like we're not enough. And so you're not alone, listeners. We all struggle with some of that. But when it becomes about, I'm flawed, I'm wrong. I love how you talk about guilt and shame. And with shame, it becomes, I'm flawed, I'm broken, I'm messed up. And that's not okay, because you are not. You're beautiful and miraculous. But sometimes we forget that. So one other question that kind of was very similar and is in the same vein, so it might be kind of similar answer, but as a person who has experienced sexual trauma and infidelity, using the 6 principles, what are some first steps I can take to begin to move towards healing?
Mm-hmm. I think learning what you can about consent and non-exploitation and how those have shown up in your life in the past, Those are relevant to sexual trauma and non-consensual sexual experiences. Those are also relevant to infidelity, like I mentioned, and the exploitative nature of infidelity. And starting to understand more of how those have showed up or how they've been missing in your past relationships and past life experiences. And, what do you want to be different in the future? I also am a big believer in EMDR, IFS, different approaches for trauma processing. I think going back to guilt and shame, part of why the 6 principles are so powerful, but also, I think both of these questions speak to them. Sometimes they can feel a little confrontational is a strong word, but they can bring up a lot for a lot of people because we haven't framed sex in this way before. It gives us a lot to reflect on our past experiences. And there's a lot of value in looking at what feelings do these things bring up for you? Is there trauma that could be processed in a different way? So that maybe the idea of some of these principles isn't maybe triggering or distressing. If there is a sense of shame that comes up, to me, that means that maybe you have negative beliefs about yourself or your right to pleasure and desire and what all of that means. And we have to kind of interrogate those beliefs a little bit. I love people are talking about embracing the principles. And to me, that's a good long-term goal. But I would say, if that feels like a reach, can we just shake their hand a little? We don't have to embrace them entirely right away. That might feel like a lot, but can we poke at them a little bit? Can we start to understand a little bit of how they've shown up in our lives in the past, how they've been missing, how we would like them to show up in the future? And it can start to kind of reframe the way that we show up in our sex lives and in our relationships in a way that's oriented towards that dance of that balance of pleasure and safety.
Yeah, making sure that safety is there, that the consent is there, that the non-exploitation is there. And when they're really there, and they're really there, now can you challenge those negative beliefs that are being triggered in your mind, that voice in your head that is a culmination of your past trauma, and say, this is different, this is safe, and do you feel safe? And if you truly do, and there is consent and non-exploitation, and the principles really exist, that's a space where you can heal. Sometimes I had someone on a group that I was doing earlier and saying that it doesn't feel like I ever can feel that way. I don't feel safe. And maybe that's not possible for some people. And they were saying, right now, I just can't feel safe. So sometimes it's baby steps. Can you feel comfortable, even with, like we've talked about in the past with pleasure, like, can you feel comfortable with a hand massage, somebody touching you in a non-sexual way first? What are some small steps that you can make? Because small steps will get you there, just like big steps will get you there. But
yeah. And you could do a whole episode. I don't know if you've done like Betty Martin and the Wheel of Consent and the 3-minute game, but that is my favorite way to tiptoe into some of finding pleasure and touch again. She has a 3-minute game. It's pretty easy to find the sort of guidelines for it on YouTube. There's a video that's definitely from the 80s, so you have to forgive the hairstyles, but it's sort of gives some interesting exercises in a non-sexual way of how do you even get into a place of thinking about how do you want to be touched? How do you want to touch someone else? And how do you ask for what you want? And how do you give? How do you think about what you can give? And it's a really interesting exercise.
I would love for you to come back and talk more about that. I think that sounds really good. Consent and all those things. I think that sounds great. What a great episode. So I hope you will come back and do that. I am going to go, gosh, we could talk forever about this because there's so much to unpack, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm going to go to the centering exercise as we do at this point in the show, because I want to get people back into their bodies. And so as we come towards the end of this episode, I would just like to invite you to just take a minute for yourself to come back into your beautiful, miraculous body. If you're able, place one hand over your heart and allow your shoulders to soften, or gently close your eyes if you're comfortable. Simply lower your gaze if you don't want to close your eyes. And then breathe with me. Take a slow, deep breath in through your nose and exhale slowly through your mouth. Again, breathe in and breathe out. Notice as you continue to breathe that your body has carried you through every experience you've had. Breathe. Moments of joy, moments of uncertainty, moments of connection, moments of healing. As you continue breathing, silently repeat these words as you breathe. 4 or 5 counts in your nose, 5 or 6 counts out your mouth. My sexuality is part of my humanity. My sexuality is part of my humanity. I deserve relationships built on consent, respect, honesty, and shared values. I deserve relationships built on respect, honesty, consent, and shared values. I give myself permission to experience pleasure without shame. I give myself permission to experience pleasure without shame. I choose curiosity over judgment, compassion over criticism, and authenticity over fear. That's a big one. Keep breathing. I choose curiosity over judgment, compassion over criticism, and authenticity over fear. I get to choose. Take one final deep breath in and let it go slowly. As you move through your week, I invite you to reflect on this question. What is one small way that I can honor my own sexual health? Not only by protecting myself, but by embracing authenticity, connection, and pleasure. So what is one small way I can honor my own sexual health? Not just by protecting myself, but by embracing authenticity, who I truly am, connection with others, and pleasure. Well, before we move back to our guest, Vic, can you tell us what is happening next week on Dr. Jeff Talks About Sex and Intimacy?
In this episode, Dr. Jeff welcomes Natasha Miller from Wonderlust to discuss how couples can keep desire alive in long-term relationships. Together they explore how communication, emotional connection, playfulness, novelty, and intentional intimacy can help reignite passion despite the challenges of stress, parenting, aging, health changes, and busy lives. Whether you're in a new relationship or have been together for years, this episode offers practical, compassionate strategies for building a deeper, more fulfilling connection. Join us on July 7th at 7 p.m. Central Time to learn more.
And we are super excited to talk about that true connection and authenticity next week. My guest, unfortunately, has had to back out for next week, but trust me, we will have an awesome episode. But this week, gosh, Jennifer, it's just been such a pleasure learning more about these 6 principles and how they really can exist in our sexual relationships. It's just been so awesome, and I really appreciate you sharing your expertise. Any final words you would like to share as we close the episode from you for our listeners whenever they're listening?
Sure. Yeah, I just appreciate you having me on. It's been a great time, and I hope that you all can do some more exploration on the 6 principles and continue to have a very pleasurable sex life.
Definitely. That's what we wish for all of you. So as you go forward with your day, wherever you are in your day, because I know some of you most of you are watching this later rather than live. But remember, healthy sexuality isn't about perfection. It's about practicing consent, honesty, shared values, protection, non-exploitation, and allowing ourselves to experience pleasure. Those 6 principles aren't just guidelines, they're an invitation to live more authentically and to love more fully. I know I want more of that. Thank you for spending time with us. If today's conversation resonated with you, I hope you'll join us again in future episodes. And thank you to my guest, Jennifer Monninger. Thank you so much for taking time to spend out of your busy life to enlighten our listeners. And thank you most of all, listeners. You are why we're here and why we do the work we do. We're so honored to be a part of your journey. Have a great one.
Who's Dr. Jeff Talk?